Okay, so I come from a family of athletes. It wasn't like anything that we were required to do, but it was almost like, I think because of our build and just our family, we love sports. And so it was natural for all of us to play sports. The sport of choice in my family is basketball. And it's interesting because even now, because I'm tall, like my dad's over 6 foot, my mom is tall, people automatically and always assume that I was gonna play basketball and take it all the way. And don't get me wrong, love basketball, Philly all day, right? But it didn't take me long to realize that basketball was not my sport. At least not my sport to play. I enjoy watching it, especially when it's live, and I love supporting my siblings when they played, and I dated a lot of basketball players, not a lot, but a few. Don't be starting, I already saw where that was going, child. It's a couple. But it didn't take me long to realize that wasn't my sport. And so outside of dance, a sport that I love to play was soccer. And I remember, I was really good at it, really good at it. And so when I was younger, I played on travel teams, and I was really into it. And I remember, it was actually a time where I got kicked out of one of my leagues. Don't worry, this time it wasn't because of a behavior thing, but what happened was we were playing, and in soccer, certain sports require you to wear protective equipment, others don't, depending on how much contact there is. And so in soccer, you wear shin guards to protect your shins from injury. And so I remember, again, playing a regular game, but I accidentally, it wasn't intentional, no, but I injured another little girl because when we were playing, I kicked her in her shin and it bruised her through the shin guard. And I remember some of the parents had gotten together and they talked to my mom and the coaches, and they were because of my size, because I've always been I wasn't always thick. I didn't get bigger until college, but in some of high school. But when I was younger, I've always had a very athletic build, and I've always been very strong. And so they were concerned that I was too strong and too big for the other girls my age. And so they actually wanted to kick me off the team. But I was really good. And so I remember one of my coaches, also he didn't just coach the women's team, he also coached the boys team. And so he pulled some strings, and instead of kicking me out of the league, they moved me over to play with older girls. And I was also the only girl on an all boys team. And so at a very young age, I was used to being around boys all the time. And it was there that I started to make more friends, because once we got over the initial awkward phase, they realized that I had similar interests. Because mind you, at that time I was wearing a size 10. I was wearing a size 10 at age 10. And then by high school, I was wearing a size 12, and they weren't making shoes, or at least not girly shoes, in my size. And so I wore sneakers a lot. And so, sneakers and sports and video games are all things that, when you start talking about those things, you start speaking guy language. And so at a very young age, and, being a tomboy myself, and, having a sister, and I always hung out with my older sister and my older brother, and my older sister's a tomboy. And so that was just kind of always the thing. And I loved being around guys because they weren't as judgy. And I had more in common with them than the average girl. Even as I got older, I found myself having more male friends than I had female friends, because I couldn't seem to keep female friends, or I didn't like them much. Just because the conversations and things that they liked and that they were into, I wasn't really into. I remember, being, I was the assistant athletic trainer in high school. And so I loved it because I got to travel with the different teams, and I was obsessed with sports medicine. And I just loved getting to see that. I got to see all the games up close and the injuries up close, and I just love that stuff. I know for the average female, they don't like that stuff, but I love that stuff. And so I found myself feeling more comfortable. And again, I try to avoid, gender, like I firmly believe in gender equality. I try to avoid gender norms and gender stereotypes, although some of them have just proven to be true. And the great thing about being around men is that they see things, they see the world and life from a different perspective. And that was always cool for me, that sometimes I agree with them and sometimes I didn't. And don't get me wrong, I've been called lesbian most of since I was younger. It's like somehow, society, again, even though I believe in gender equality and I don't believe that what society says that a female should be able to do and what she should like and what she should do is right, and what I feel like men, they shouldn't be confined by what society says they should like and do, and I hate when I hear those things. And so I know that when people were calling me lesbian and all those kind of things, it was really because they couldn't understand and wrap their heads around the idea that I was a non-traditional woman. I'm actually more excited and I'm more proud of that now because, when I was younger, there wasn't a lot of representation in that, but you're starting to see that more now. I remember back when I was doing the unisex, I used to love I can rock boy clothes, but make them look feminine. And so it's interesting, like, it's like when you're the first and when you're the only, it's not a trend, but then all of a sudden it's a trend. And so like nowadays wearing sneakers as a female is embraced, and you have all this unisex clothing now, but don't forget who was one of the first to do it, child. I was doing it at a young age, child. I remember my mom was like, we used to be the girls in line for the Jordan releases. I was the first to have them, child. And if you stepped, I was wearing force field. And if I got a crease in my shoe, it ruined my entire day. If you scuffed my Tim, I wanted to fight you. I'm still like that to this day, but I'm probably not as intense as I used to be. But I just always had a connection to men in that way. And so when I was diagnosed with alopecia, and I had to figure out just what I wanted to do with my hair, because I didn't like wearing wigs and they were hot and uncomfortable. And I just, nowadays you got girls who rip off their wigs with no shame, child. But back in the day, having your wig fall off was traumatic. So I knew that I couldn't wear wigs forever. And so I had to figure out what to do with my hair. And so even though I was still a girl and, I still love getting nothing I love more than getting, my nails done and my feet done and all those things, right? And I still enjoy them and I love and I bask and I embrace my femininity. I've been going to the barbershop, I want to say at least for about, the past, 8 years. And so it's always interesting to me when I first enter a new barbershop, and I've gone in barbershops now, literally I've done Midwest, I've done down South, I've done, Philly, and Philly is known for barbershops and for their haircuts. And so it's always interesting when I first come into a barbershop how uncomfortable men are. Because it's almost like you're invading their territory. It's like that is their space, that is their safe space where they get to be men, child. It's almost like the gym. The gym and the barbershop are just two places where like men feel comfortable being men. And so when a woman comes in, it's like we're invading their space. And so whenever I come in, when I first come in, it's always that awkward period of like, okay, they're watching what they say and watching what they do, and they're super polite. But I've learned, over time that once they kind of get a feel for me, sometimes it happens within the first time I'm there, or sometimes it requires me coming back a couple of times. But eventually when they start to see that I am a non-traditional woman and that I am easy to talk to and that we have very similar interests, it's been amazing and beautiful because, and once I get comfortable and they get comfortable, the barbershop has become a place that I love to be. And where at first they are so awkward and don't want to talk to me, it gets to a point where like they can't wait for me to come in, child. And so it's always interesting to have these conversations with men, and there's always men of different ages, and for the most part they are Black men, but occasionally I encounter men who are not Black. And we have some of the most colorful conversations. Sometimes it feels like, and mind you, I'm a very opinionated and very strong-headed a woman. And so sometimes I feel like I'm on trial for everything that a woman, every hurt, every pain, everything, every trauma that a woman has put on a man. I am on trial for that thing. But then also like, and I feel like I have to, defend my ladies when I go in there, especially my black women when I go in there. But then there are also times where I empathize with men, and I understand, and they teach me something that I didn't know, and they introduce me to a perspective, or they allow me to see something in a different light, and I love that. And so it's always been great to have these amazing conversations where it's like not me talking down to them or teaching them, but it's kind of a mixture of both. And so, the barbershop has become a place where I make a lot of friends, and I have a lot of, like, they've even informed my work a lot. And so we're like, now I love studying like mental health and just like the male identity, especially the black male identity. And it's just interesting, especially in recent years, where I've just learned that there's so much misinformation and so many misinformed ideas on both sides, not just on the male side, but even on the female side, about, especially within the black community, about what they expect and what they like and how things should be. But more importantly, even about accountability and like just the way that we view things and what's in and what we value, etc. And so I would think about a recent conversation that I had, and I was actually minding my business. Minding my business. I was in my phone. It was actually a day where I wasn't even planning on talking or engaging as much. I have those days sometimes where I'm like, they draw me into a conversation that I wasn't even planning on having. But I remember I overheard a young guy talking about, the hot girls and about how, and the city girls, and about how, like, just how the generation of women, they're so backwards these days. And mind you, you might notice in my bio, I say city girl with a Southern hospitality. I don't mean that in like the new age city girl. When I say city girl, I refer to me being from Philly, but having Southern mannerisms. I'm not proclaiming to be a city girl, because I'm not, child. I don't know. I ain't out here scamming. I don't believe in any of those things. No shade to them, but I don't claim to be a part of that. But when I say city girl, I'm referring to being from the city, like how it used to be. But I overheard him talking about the hot girls and about women these days being so misguided, and it made me. It's one of them things that made me want to, roll my neck. It's very there's not many things that I'm not really surprised too much by things that I hear men say these days, but there are some things that still make me roll my neck, and that was one of them. And I remember just in that conversation of just talking about accountability, and that I never want to excuse or justify toxic behavior, and that's on either side, as a woman or as a male. But I think it's also important that we hold each other accountable and recognize that in any kind of dynamic and relationship, that it takes two to tango, and that in any kind of conflict that you're having, any kind of issue, whether that be in a platonic or romantic relationship, or even like, within your family, there's always multiple sides to a story. But also I think there's roles that everybody plays, every party plays. And so one thing I had to school young boy is that, like, many of the hot girls of today are women who are sick of being abused and taken advantage of and hurt. You gotta think, like, most of the time a person has just become a bully overnight. They like, no one actually really wants to not have love. When I see people posting things like, I'm anti-love, and I don't want a relationship, and I don't want to be, you're lying. And I believe in calling a spade, and I'm saying that as somebody who has been a girl been a woman who says that she didn't want those things. And I know that when I was saying them, it was coming from a hurt place. And I also know, when I've been around women, and I am a woman enough to know that when people say those things, they don't really mean it. As many a times it's coming from a place of hurt, of I am just tired of putting myself out there. I am tired of feeling dumb and being taken advantage of and being hurt. And they feel like somehow, some way that if they say those things and they present that version of themselves, somehow it'll prevent them from being hurt. But trust and believe that the hot girls and the hot boys are still out here getting hurt. But more importantly, that, deep down, they do want to be loved. We all do. And not only do we want to be loved, but we want to be loved the right way. And I think that goes on the other side, this idea of it's a cycle, what I'm saying? Like, even for my men who are players and who are avoiding commitment, it's not because they want to be. Because again, whether you look at it in a biblical sense of like how the Bible says that we aren't designed to be alone, or even in a scientific academic lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that on a basic level, every human wants to be free and they want to be loved and accepted and belong and to have a place of belonging. Like that's a basic human need. That's void of color, race, ethnicity, gender. Everyone on a basic level wants to be loved, wants to be accepted, wants to be free. All right, and so I think it's important that on both sides that we hold each other accountable. That what we're seeing today is people who have, and mind you, and now we've seen it from just generation to generation, there's so much hurt and so much pain and so much trauma, especially within the Black community, that I think that people are creating these these false, I don't know what you call personas in a way, or like, just I think in a way to preserve themselves. I think it's important to say that because I think when you understand that, you learn to have more empathy for the opposite sex, so that you can understand them better. And I think prior to having, and mind you, I'm not saying that I'm the expert in all of those things, but I think now that I've done a little bit more research and just being able to be around more men and having them open up to me and feeling comfortable opening up to me, I've learned just, again, this idea, there's so many misconceptions that we have about one another, and about life, and even like with things that we value and that we think are important. And just even as I've done more research, as I've explored, and even with my clients, I've learned that a lot of it comes back to our families. One thing that I teach in my classes, and that I teach folks, is that I do this exercise, and it's called the personal histories exercise, because many of us don't know this, but we are introduced to relationships within our families, because our families are our first teams. And so that means that how your attitudes and your behaviors as an adult have everything to do with the attitudes and the behaviors that you saw or that you experienced in your childhood, right? And so that comes from, things like your like mothers and fathers and siblings. They taught you how to be, and you learned how to be who you are based off of your interactions with them, and so, for example, like, so things like, absentee fathers, things like, and they exist. I think, especially you look at the data within our community, I think I told somebody before that, just on a national level in the US, 43% of the US grew up without a father, and that was a few years ago. So who knows what that number is now? But when I looked, that number was double in the Black community. So think about how many people, both male and female, who grew up without fathers, and what that did for many of them. Things that were supposed to be. I mean, I believe in I believe in the power of fatherhood and motherhood, and I believe that you should have both, right? Because I think that having both in your life creates a balance. Because there are some things that, again, while I do believe in gender equality, there are some things that a woman is naturally more inclined to do and to teach you, and the same thing for a male and a father. That there are some things that they're more inclined to do and to teach you. And when you don't have one of them, or when one of them is taught to you in an unhealthy way, it does show up in your attitudes and behaviors, even in my own, And so I know a lot of times we talk a lot about, fatherhood. And so I think a lot about what absentee fathers, what that does to men. A lot of times men have to become the heads of their households when they're just young men. And so that's why you see a lot of men today who value money so much, because when they're younger, a lot of times they're taught that the role of a male is just to provide. And so many times we're beating men down because they're not providing for us in other areas, when in reality, most men are not taught to provide in the mental and emotional and the spiritual areas. they're taught that as men, it's their job to be the breadwinners and to bring it home. And so many times you're having, as a woman in a relationship, you're not saying you should go into that prepared, but sometimes it's something that men don't learn until they're in relationships, and vice versa. I think even as far as women who don't have fathers in their lives, they're taught to be hyper independent. I was that girl, hyper independent, especially women who maybe the male figures in their lives that they did have, you know, weren't the best or didn't give them that safety and security. So many times women don't know how to be women because they weren't in environments or like, I know, remember for me, I was, mind you, I had a house because once my brother was the oldest, so once he left, the rest of us were all women, and we were building bookshelves and we were moving couches and we were doing things that, you know, some of my friends when I went to college, they had daddies who did those things, and I didn't have that. I wasn't daddy's little girl at that time. And so, you know, it's interesting that, you know, as I've grown in my femininity of this idea of what it means to be a woman, right, and what it means to be feminine and to allow a male to lead, right? And so we see that. But then also I think too, sometimes we give fathers a hard time and we don't hold mothers accountable. Because I'm also learning about how motherhood, you know, can be something as well, because of the fact that mothers are primary in the household, and that there is such a thing as toxic motherhood. I think something I'm saying that as a woman, because many times, and I said this before, of this idea of identity is so strong and is so prevalent, right, and it's so important, and that many a times women are becoming mothers before they fully know who they are, and so they put so much of their identity and purpose into being a mother, and sometimes that does create space for toxicity. And I know I'm going to be unpopular for saying all of these things, but it's real. And that, you know, you see it a lot when mothers they turn sons into husbands, right? Because you gotta think, when you don't have something, right, when you're lacking in one area, you try to overcompensate for another area, right? So for example, if you ever broken a limb, so if you ever, you know, if you break, you know what I'm saying, if you injure your left hand, right, you're forced to put more pressure on your right. Or when you can't use, you know, one thing, you're having to overexert or overuse another area, right? And so you have to think, okay, if there's no father in the home, where is that pressure going? And so sometimes that is coming from, and it does, like, you know, I think for a male, sometimes it is this idea of you're becoming a husband in your teens, right? And so how, you know, and many times you're already the head of a household. So mind you, you can't be a head of two households, right? It's only one head, right? You notice in our body, we have two of mostly everything, but not our head, because you can't have, because a head, you can't have two heads leading. And so a lot of times you'll see is that struggle between, if a male is already the head of his household with his mother, it's hard for him to be a head of a household with a wife. Right? And so like there's always that battle, and you see it's played out so many times in movies and TV shows when like the wives and the girlfriends bump head with their mother, because they're both fighting for the head of the household, essentially. And so that can be something that I see happen a lot when you don't have either presence or identity within parenthood. I've also learned, you know, about sexual abuse and sexual assault. I think a lot of times, you know, when you see it in society, we always think and as somebody who's a victim of both, it is a lot more common in women. But I think sometimes we forget or we're unaware of how often it happens with males. You know, and I think it's important to acknowledge, you know, and to be able to define what abuse and what assault is. And like, you know, whether it was, I met so many men who their first sexual encounter was with a woman who was way older than them, or a girl who was way older than them, you know, or they were taking it, and because it's considered cool, or because it's more common, I met so many men who don't even realize that they were victims of sexual assault and sexual abuse, right? But they were. And that's where you get this idea, and for men, many of them, that's where this idea of hypersexuality comes from. So men who were super into sex, that came from what they were exposed to when they were younger. And again, all these things don't make anyone bad, because at the end of the day, when it comes to being parents, and I'm not a parent yet, so I don't want to ever speak out of turn in that, but being someone who has to help raise kids sometimes, who has had to raise some of your children, right? It's this idea of people can only do, and they only know what they know. And many times if you were a victim and you don't know you were a victim, you don't always know that you are victimizing someone else. or if you haven't addressed your hurt and your trauma, many a times you impose or you expose your children to that. And I think that's one of the things that, and not even one of the things, but the primary thing that I think that has created this big gender divide within the Black community, but also, which I think has been one of the biggest barriers to us being able to win. You know, you want to kill something, they say you cut off the head, right? You want to kill a snake, you want to kill anything, you got to cut the head off. And what's the head? The head is, of course, I mean, yes, it's a father, but the head is parenthood. And so I think systemically and systematically, society, and one of the ways that, you know, even like looking at just civil rights and just history of America, that's been one of the ways that we've you know, handicapped and we've disabled the black communities by cutting off the head. And that's removing the father or traumatizing the mother, or removing the mother and traumatizing the father. You know, I even think about, like, you know, I hear so much about, you know, now mind you, I think even to that point, a lot of fathers get a bad rap, because I also know so many men who are great fathers or who want to be great fathers and have to deal with women who weaponize children, which is so common, right? And that they prevent men from being fathers because they're hurt. And they know that, hey, if you hurt me romantically, I know I can hurt you emotionally, or you hurt me emotionally in the relationship, I can hurt you emotionally with what you care about, which are your children, right? And so I've seen that happen a lot, and that there are great fathers and men who want to be fathers who aren't allowed to be fathers, right? And vice versa, right? Mothers who want to be good mothers, but because they're playing two different roles, right, they can't be. And so, again, not blaming one or the other, and not saying that it's an apply all, or that anyone's guilty of it, but it is something that I've noticed is so big, and that if we don't address it, and if we don't, make it right, it's something that is continually passed down. You know, I hear people, you know, you use the term, and even I've used it, about generational curses. And sometimes there's some common ones that we use, but there are also some underlying generational curses, and that's one of them, this idea of broken families. And it's sad, because, you know, being that I do get to see and I get to hang around so many younger kids, and mind you, we're always talking about Gen Z and Gen Z this and Gen Z that. I like to always, mind you, as a millennial, and I've been in so many rooms where people didn't even know that I was a millennial, and I've heard, oh, those damn millennials. And I'm like, I want to say, like, excuse me, you raised them. Like, the Gen Zers today were raised by millennials and boomers, and millennials were raised by boomers. It's like, these are your kids. So back to that idea of accountability, of own your stuff, right? Of what you see is based off of what we expose them to. And I think the same way that you can expose and you can people, and where you can learn toxic and negative and unhealthy behaviors, I also believe that you can unlearn, and that you can expose, children, our next generation, to, better ones. And I know that's easier said than done, right? And you're probably like, okay, it sounds good, but how do I do that? And I think if you're asking me on a personal or professional level, I believe that it starts with examining our own individual and personal traumas and embarking on our own individual healing processes. At the end of the day, if we learn to unlearn our own trauma, and if we do our own healing, right, then we're more mindful about what traumas and what unhealthy and toxic behaviors and attitudes that we expose our children to, right? And then more importantly, once we're able to correct things in ourselves, we do it in others, right? I know even for me, and something that I've been really passionate about is, I don't have children yet. And so one thing that I'm trying to do in preparation for that, I don't want to wait until I have children, right? And sometimes, like, you ever notice, like, mind you, I can curse my butt off, right? I got a sailor's mouth sometimes, and it's different when you hear, like, when your baby starts to say a curse word, and it makes you more mindful of, maybe I shouldn't be using that language, maybe I shouldn't be using that terminology. And that was me, right? I had a tendency to say bad words, but then when I started to see the kids around me start to use negative language, it made me want to check myself and go, you know what? Yes, just because I can doesn't mean that I should. And it's just the example that I want to set. And something that I'm doing as an adult and I'm doing before I have children is I'm trying to identify and to remedy and to correct unhealthy behaviors and attitudes before I have kids. That way when I have them, I'm not exposing them to some of the same behaviors and attitudes that I had. And again, that's a journey, it's a process, it doesn't happen overnight, and I think it's important that we give ourselves grace on this self-healing, self-growth journey, because it's, Rome wasn't built in a day and it's not going to happen in a day. But I think the more mindful and the more intentional you are about the process, it's better. And so all in all, I think when we talk about, this idea of restoring the Black family and enhancing our culture and moving the culture and common sense forward, it really starts with us really getting to the root of our issues and healing. And I think that comes from, it needs to stop being a battle of the sexes, the men versus the women, and generations versus, generation versus generation. It needs to be less about us highlighting our differences and in a negative way, and more about how do we appreciate our differences and how do we look at what each of us bring to the family, right? There's things that the older generation can teach and learn from the younger generation and vice versa. There are things that men can learn from women and that women can learn from men. And I think if you look at it more as a team aspect than a us versus them, that's the key to seeing the advancement and the success that we want to see. And that's how we push ourselves forward and really start to live as the kings and the queens that we were created and designed to be.